There's something that happens quietly, not suddenly, not dramatically, just quietly. Elena noticed it first on a Tuesday morning. She had gotten up, made coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and realized she had nowhere to be. Not that day, not the next, not really that week either. For 32 years, Elena had walked. Every single morning, in every kind of weather, through the same streets of the same neighborhoods in San Antonio, delivering mail to people she knew by name. She knew which houses had dogs. She knew which mailboxes stuck. She knew that Mr. Hendricks on Primrose always left a thank you card at Christmas, and that the family on the corner had a new baby because the packages started arriving differently. She knew all of this because she moved through it every day, rain or shine. And then she retired, and the walking stopped. At first, it felt like rest. She had earned it, 32 years of early mornings and heavy bags and summers in Texas that no one who hasn't lived there can quite imagine. Rest felt right, but rest became routine, and routine became something else, something she didn't have a name for yet. 6 months after retirement, Elena's daughter Marcella noticed that her mother seemed different. Not sad exactly, not confused, just slower. Like something had turned down a dial that used to run at full volume. Elena noticed it too. She just didn't know what was causing it. What was happening to Elena was not just depression, not just grief, though grief had certainly left its mark on her life, and not simply aging, despite what many people around her quietly assumed. The changes she was experiencing had a physical explanation, a biological explanation, one that researchers have spent decades trying to understand. And yet, outside of scientific circles, almost no one talks about it, because the direction of the story surprises people. Most of us grow up believing that the brain is the leader and the body is the follower. We imagine that cognitive decline begins somewhere deep inside the brain and that physical decline comes afterward. We assume memory fades first, attention weakens first, motivation disappears first, and then, eventually, the body slows down to match. But that is not always what happens. A growing body of research suggests that the relationship works in both directions. The brain influences the body, but the body also influences the brain, constantly, every day, with every walk, every climb up a staircase, every trip to the grocery store, every movement that seems too ordinary to matter. The human brain evolved alongside movement, not separately from it. For most of human history, movement was not exercise. It was survival. People walked to find food, walked to find water, walked to visit family, walked to work, walked because remaining still for long periods simply wasn't part of daily life. The brain developed in partnership with that reality. Movement wasn't an optional activity. It was one of the primary signals that helped the brain understand the world around it. And when those signals begin to disappear, subtle changes can begin to unfold. Not overnight, not dramatically, not in a way that immediately alarms doctors or family members. Instead, the changes often arrive quietly. A little less energy, a little less curiosity, a little less confidence, a little less desire to leave the house, a little more time spent sitting, a little more hesitation before doing things that once felt automatic. Most people never connect these experiences to movement. They blame stress, they blame age, they blame personality, they blame retirement. Sometimes they blame themselves, but researchers studying aging, cognition, and physical activity have repeatedly found that movement affects far more than muscles and joints. It affects blood flow, it affects mood, it affects memory, it affects attention. It affects the brain's ability to adapt and reorganize itself. In other words, movement is not merely something the body does. Movement is information. Information that the brain continuously receives and responds to. And when that information becomes scarce, the consequences can extend far beyond physical fitness. That was the hidden story unfolding inside Elena's life. She didn't know it. Her family didn't know it, Most people in her situation wouldn't know it either, because the changes were gradual enough to feel normal, reasonable, expected. The kind of changes people often accept as an unavoidable part of getting older. But what if some of those changes are not as inevitable as they seem? What if the brain is responding to something we rarely pay attention to? What if one of the most powerful influences on cognitive health isn't found in a pill, a supplement, or a brain training app, but in something far simpler, something the human body was designed to do every single day? To understand what happened to Elena, we first need to understand what happens inside the brain when movement begins to disappear, and the science behind that story is far more surprising than most people realize. Stay with me. Elena sat across from me and described what she called just feeling off, not sick, not in pain, not simply depressed, she was careful to say. Just off. When I asked her to describe a typical day, she paused for a moment. I make coffee, she said. I watch the morning news. I call Marcella. I make lunch. I watch a little more television. Sometimes I go to the grocery store. And then it's evening. She said it without complaint, almost without emotion. And that absence of emotion was, in itself, something I noticed. None of this felt significant to Elena while it was happening. It was just Tuesday. It was just the job. But when the job ended, all of it ended together. The movement, the navigation, the social contact, the small daily challenges, the reason to leave. And what replaced it was comfort, legitimate, well-earned comfort, a quiet house. No schedule, no heavy bag, no Texas summer at 8 in the morning. Rest felt right. For a while, rest felt like exactly what her body had been asking for. But the body can recover in stillness. It does not thrive in permanent stillness. And neither, it turns out, does the brain. What Elena experienced in the months after retirement was not simply an emotional adjustment to a new chapter. Something more specific was happening, something that had less to do with how she felt about retirement and more to do with what her brain was no longer receiving. There is a concept in neuroscience that I think about often in my practice, not because it is complicated, because it is honest. Use it or lose it. Most people have heard that phrase applied to muscles, to strength, to flexibility. Fewer people realize that a version of it applies to the brain as well. The brain is not a fixed structure that simply deteriorates with time. It is a living system that continuously reorganizes itself in response to what we ask of it. Neuroscientists call this neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to adapt, to strengthen connections that are regularly used, and to quiet the ones that are not. This process does not stop at 60 or 70 or 80. It continues for as long as we live, which means the brain is always responding to something. The question is, what are we giving it to respond to? For Elena, the answer had changed dramatically, and one region of the brain may have felt that change more than others. Deep within the temporal lobe sits a small, curved structure called the hippocampus. It plays a central role in memory, especially the formation of new memories and the ability to navigate space. When you remember where you park the car, retrace a walking route, or recall what someone said to you yesterday, the hippocampus is involved, and researchers studying aging and physical activity have found something important. Movement appears to support hippocampal health in ways that are especially relevant for memory, learning, and navigation. Not by magic, through several overlapping mechanisms that researchers are still working to fully understand. One of them involves blood flow. When we move, circulation increases, including circulation to the brain. The hippocampus, like all brain tissue, depends on a steady supply of oxygen and glucose. When that supply is rich and consistent, the tissue has more of what it needs to function well. Another mechanism involves a protein called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. BDNF is sometimes described informally as fertilizer for the brain. That is a simplification, but not an unreasonable one. BDNF supports the health and survival of existing neurons, and it plays a role in the connections between them. Physical activity, especially sustained aerobic movement, has been linked in many studies to changes in BDNF. And in research settings, higher BDNF levels have been associated with better performance on some memory and learning tasks. One well-known study followed older adults through a year of moderate aerobic exercise, mostly walking. At the end of the year, brain imaging showed measurable increases in hippocampal volume in the exercise group. The group that remained more sedentary showed the opposite pattern. I want to be careful here, because the science is real, but it is still evolving. We are not talking about reversing dementia. We are not talking about guaranteed outcomes, and no single study explains everything. What the research suggests, across many studies and populations, is that movement supports the conditions under which the brain tends to function better. Better blood flow, a more supportive chemical environment, better capacity to adapt, better support for memory, attention, and navigation. Elena had been giving her brain many of those signals for 32 years, every morning, without knowing it. 6 miles of blood flow. 6 miles of spatial navigation, 6 miles of small decisions, social contact, changing light, uneven ground, and familiar streets. 6 miles of a brain chemistry she never had a name for. And when retirement arrived, it did not just change her schedule. It likely changed the daily signals shaping her brain. Not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily, in the quiet, unremarkable way that many meaningful losses arrive. The fog she described, the nekoha, the flatness, the just feeling off, was not imaginary. It was not weakness, and it was not something we should casually dismiss as inevitable aging. It may have been her brain responding, honestly and precisely, to the absence of something it had quietly depended on for years, something she had never been told it needed. That is what I want you to hold on to as we continue. Not fear, not urgency, just understanding. Because understanding changes what feels possible, and what feels possible is more than most people realize. When Elena came back for her second appointment, she brought Marcella with her. Marcella was warm, attentive, clearly devoted to her mother. She sat slightly forward in her chair the entire time, the way people do when they are trying to help, and are not quite sure how. At one point, she said something I have heard many times over the years, in many different forms. "We've been trying to make things easier for her," she said. "Since my father passed, we don't want her to have to do too much." She meant it with complete love. I have no doubt about that. But there is something hidden inside that sentence that I have learned to listen for very carefully. We don't want her to have to do too much. The impulse is protective. The instinct is caring. And the effect, without anyone intending it, can sometimes be the opposite of what everyone wants. When we remove effort from someone's life, even with the best intentions, we can also remove the stimulus that keeps that person engaged. The small challenges that require navigation, the errands that require planning, the tasks that require the body to move through space with purpose. These are not always burdens. Sometimes they are a kind of medicine. Not the kind that comes in a bottle, the kind that comes from remaining a participant in your own life. I see this pattern often in my practice. A parent falls, or loses a spouse, or retires, and the family, out of love and fear, begins quietly absorbing the demands of that person's daily life. They do the grocery shopping, they handle the driving, they take care of the things that used to require the older person to move, to plan, to engage. And the older person, who is grieving, tired, and perhaps relieved, accepts the help because it feels like care, because it is care. But the body interprets the reduction in demand differently than the heart does. The body does not know that the family is helping. The body only knows that it is being asked to do less. And when the body is asked to do less, It begins to prepare for a life that requires less. Muscle becomes quieter, balance becomes less practiced. The cardiovascular system operates at a lower register, and the brain receives fewer signals from a body engaged with the world. None of this is irreversible. That is the part I want to be very clear about. None of this is a sentence, but it does require recognition. It requires someone, a doctor, a daughter, a friend, sometimes just a voice on a screen, to name what is happening before it becomes harder to address. Elena listened to all of this very carefully. Marcella did too. There was a long pause after I finished. Then Elena said something I have thought about many times since. "I thought I was resting," she said, "but I think I was disappearing." I did not correct her, because she was not wrong. Part of what she was describing has a name in clinical medicine: deconditioning. And while we usually talk about deconditioning as a physical process, its consequences rarely stay only physical. It affects strength, balance, endurance, confidence, the willingness to leave the house, the sense that the world is still something you can move through. And over time, it can influence the systems that help us remain oriented, motivated, curious, and capable of engaging with daily life, including the brain. The good news, and there is genuinely good news here, is that the same relationship can work in the other direction. The brain that responds to the absence of movement can also respond to its return, not immediately, not dramatically, but often more than people expect, which is where Elena's story takes a turn. Not a dramatic one, not a miraculous one, just an honest one. The kind that happens when someone finally understands what has been changing inside their own body and decides to give it something different. I did not give Elena a program. I want to be clear about that. I did not hand her a schedule or a list of exercises or a plan with phases and progressions and weekly targets. That was not what she needed first. And honestly, it is rarely what anyone needs at the beginning of this kind of conversation. What Elena needed first was something simpler. She needed to understand what had happened, not in medical terms, in human terms. So I asked her a question. "When you were working," I said, "what was the first thing you did every morning before you left the house?" She thought about it for a moment. "I checked my route," she said. "I always looked at what I had that day. How many stops? Which neighborhoods?" "And how did that feel?" I asked. She paused again. "Like I knew what I was for," she said. "I have been practicing medicine for 24 years, and I still write down the things patients say that stop me. That one stopped me, like I knew what I was for." Because that is part of what purposeful movement gives the brain, not just physical stimulus, not just elevated heart rate, not just increased circulation, but orientation, a reason to organize the day around something that exists outside the self, a destination, a small but real demand. The research around this is broad and I think underappreciated. Older adults who maintain regular physical activity often show benefits that extend well beyond the physical: better mood, better sleep, better mobility, better confidence, better performance in some areas of attention and executive function, the kind of thinking that allows us to plan, to organize, and to respond flexibly when life changes. Physical activity is also often linked with more social engagement, greater independence, and a stronger sense of personal agency. The belief that what you do still matters, that your choices still shape your experience, that you are still, in the most important sense, a participant. These are not small things. For many people over 60, the quiet erosion of that sense of agency is one of the most painful and least discussed parts of aging. Not only the physical changes, the feeling of becoming a passenger in your own life. Movement, regular, purposeful, embodied movement, is one of the most practical ways to interrupt that erosion. Not because it solves everything, but because it sends a signal. to the muscles, to the cardiovascular system, to the brain, a signal that says there is still something to prepare for, there is still somewhere to go. The body, when it receives that signal consistently, often responds. It maintains what it might otherwise begin to release. I explained this to Elena in simpler terms. I told her that her brain had spent 32 years expecting movement, expecting navigation, expecting the daily signal that said the world required her participation, and that when that signal disappeared, her brain had not failed. It had adapted to a quieter life, to a smaller set of demands. The fog was not proof that she was broken. It may have been, at least in part, adaptation. The brain, like any living system, changes in response to what is repeatedly asked of it. Elena looked at me for a moment. "So it's not that I'm getting old," she said. "It's that I stopped asking my brain to stay awake." I told her that was a very good way to understand it. And then I asked her something I ask many of my patients when we reach this point in the conversation. Not what program she wanted to follow, not what goals she wanted to set, just this. "What is one place," I said, "that you used to go regularly, that you have stopped going to?" She did not have to think long. "The market on Commerce Street," she said. "On Saturday mornings. Carlos and I used to go every week. After he died, I just stopped." "How far is it?" I asked. "About 6 blocks," she said. "Maybe 7. I told her that was where we were going to start. Not with a program, not with a target, with a market, 6 blocks away, on a Saturday morning, the way she used to. Elena went to the market the following Saturday. She told me about it at our next appointment. She had walked there alone, which surprised her, she said, because she had not planned to. She had intended to drive, park nearby, and walk just the last block or two. But when she got to the car, she stopped. It was a cool morning for San Antonio, the kind of morning that does not last long in Texas, so you notice it when it arrives. She stood by the car for a moment, and then she left the car where it was and walked 6 blocks there, 6 blocks back. She bought tomatoes, she told me, and a bunch of cilantro she did not strictly need. She spoke briefly to a woman at one of the stalls who recognized her from years ago. Just a few sentences, nothing dramatic. On the way home, she noticed the light on the street in a way she had not in a long time, the way it came through the trees in the early morning, the way the neighborhood looked different on foot than it did through a car window. She got home, put the tomatoes on the counter, and sat down at the kitchen table, and realized she felt different than she had in months, not transformed, not healed, just present. I want to be careful about how I tell this part of the story, because it would be easy here to suggest that 6 blocks to a market fixed something. It did not. One walk does not reverse months of reduced activity. One Saturday morning does not rebuild what a year of stillness has quietly changed. But it does something that I think we underestimate when we talk about movement and the aging brain. It reminds the system that it still can. There is a concept in rehabilitation medicine that I find useful far beyond its clinical context. It is called self-efficacy, the belief, based on actual experience, not encouragement, that you are capable of doing something. Self-efficacy is confidence built from proof, from doing. And for many people over 60 who have gradually reduced their movement, the erosion of self-efficacy can become one of the most significant barriers to beginning again. Not always physical limitation, not always medical restriction, but the quiet accumulation of avoided experiences that slowly convinces the body and brain that certain things are no longer available. The stairs that started feeling uncertain, the walks that started feeling tiring, the trips that started feeling like too much planning. Each avoidance on its own seems reasonable, sensible even, but each avoidance also sends a message to the muscles, to the balance system, to the brain, a message that says, we do not do that anymore. And the system, which is always listening, updates accordingly. What Elena experienced on that Saturday morning was the beginning of the opposite process, a message sent in the other direction. We still do this. We can still navigate. We can still go somewhere and come back. We can still notice the light through the trees. That message, repeated consistently over time, is how the system begins to update again, not through intensity, not through discipline, through repetition, through the steady accumulation of small experiences that remind the brain and the body of what they are still capable of. In the weeks that followed, Elena went back to the market, not every Saturday, most Saturdays. She began walking to a few other places she had been driving to out of habit. The pharmacy 2 blocks from her house, the church she attended on Sunday mornings, the small park where she and Carlos used to sit in the evenings, which she had been avoiding without quite admitting it to herself. None of these were workouts. None of them were exercise in the way most people use that word. They were movement with a destination, movement that asked something of her. Navigation, decision, presence. The things her brain had been doing every morning for 32 years and had quietly stopped expecting. 3 months later, Marcella called me. She wanted to tell me something her mother had said. She told me she feels like herself again, Marcella said. Not completely, but more than she has in a long time. I have heard variations of that sentence many times, and it still matters every time, not because the science behind it is not real. It is, but because the science only tells part of the story. The other part is this: feeling like yourself again is not a small thing. For many people, it is the whole thing. It is the difference between participating in your life and watching it from a careful distance. Elena had spent over a year watching. 6 blocks changed the direction, not the destination, the direction. And sometimes that is exactly enough to begin. I want to pause here for a moment, because I'm aware that Elena's story, as real and as specific as it is, might feel, to some of you, like it belongs to someone else. Maybe you're still working. Maybe you never stopped moving. Maybe the challenge you're facing isn't retirement or loss, it's something else. A health event, a season of caregiving, a gradual shift in what the body will and won't do as comfortably as it once did. The circumstances vary, but the underlying pattern is surprisingly consistent. The brain and the body are in continuous conversation, and when the body becomes quieter, for whatever reason, at whatever age, the brain receives that silence as information, not as rest, as instruction. And it responds accordingly. What I want you to take from Elena's story is not the specific details, it's the direction, the fact that the conversation can change. That movement is not medicine you take to slow an inevitable process. It is a signal, a fundamental biological signal that the system is still being asked to participate. And participation, for the brain, is not a luxury. It is the condition under which the brain continues to do what we most need it to do. Remember, navigate, adapt, remain oriented in the world, remain oriented in our own lives. The patients who age most capably are rarely the ones who followed the most rigorous exercise programs. They are often the ones who simply never stopped moving through their world with purpose, who kept going places, who kept doing things that required their body to show up, who kept gently reclaiming the small opportunities that life still offered, even when what they reclaimed was modest, even when it was 6 blocks to a market on a Saturday morning. None of this needs to be dramatic. None of it needs to look like fitness. It just needs to be consistent. And it needs to begin or continue or resume with the understanding that the brain is paying attention, that it is always listening to what the body is doing, that what you ask of your body today shapes what your brain will be prepared to do tomorrow. Elena understood that, not as a medical concept, as something she had lived without knowing it for 32 years, and something she chose, quietly and without fanfare, to begin living again, 6 blocks at a time. I started this channel because of my mother, Margaret, who began limiting her world at 71 and died at 76, having lived her last years in a life that had grown too small for who she was. She didn't know what was happening. I didn't know how to stop it in time. But I have spent the years since learning everything I can about what drives that process and what interrupts it. And what I have found again and again in the research and in my patients and in stories like Elena's is this: the body responds when you ask something of it, even now. Even after months or years of asking less, the system is listening. It has always been listening, and it is more ready to respond than most people believe. Elena found her way back to a market 6 blocks away, and in doing so, found her way back to something larger, to presence, to orientation, to the quiet, reliable feeling of being someone who still moves through the world. That is available to you too, not as encouragement, as medicine. If this conversation meant something to you, I'd be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, we're here every week with the same honesty and the same care. But before you go, I want to leave you with one question, not a challenge, not an assignment, just something to sit with. What is one place your body used to take you that it no longer does? Leave it in the comments if you'd like. I read them. And sometimes just naming the place is enough to begin. I'll see you next time.